Bueno, gracias por venir a mi charla. Porque pienso que mi español no está suficiente bueno ahora, voy a hacer la presentación en inglés, entonces lo siento por eso. So, then I will talk, as said Marie-Noël, I will talk about the emplacement dynamics of pyroclastic flows, and most specifically on the fluidization, on the ability of the pyroclastic flow to be fluidized. So I will first do an introduction about pyroclastic density currents and also about gas particle fluidization, because it's a mechanism that is supposed to have a big influence of on the emplacement of some pyroclastic flows at least. Then I will present the result of my experimental studies with the first one, which is about the substrate roughness, or the influence of the substrate roughness on the propagation of the flows. And then another kind of experiments where I used a bed of particles that I made fall on a static column to investigate on the fluidization by the falling of this particle in a static fluid. And then I will conclude. So first, pyroclastic density current I consider a hot mixture of gas and particles, which can be either ash, pumice, lithics, or crystals, that flow thanks to gravity because they are denser than the surrounding fluid, generally the air. So there is different mechanism for the generation of pyroclastic density currents. So I present just some of them here. For example, the fallback of an eruptive column when the mixture is not able anymore to mix well with the ambient air, and then it's much denser than the air and will fall back. If the mixture doesn't ascend sufficiently fast, it will kind of spill over the vent and form pyroclastic density current directly, which is called boiling over. But basically, these two mechanisms are the same. And then in the case of a lava dome that is formed at the vent, well, the structure being really unstable, it can collapse at least partially to form pyroclastic density currents. And another example is the brutal decompression of the magma, for example, the blast, when the magma is put directly in contact with the atmosphere, for example, because of destabilization of the edifice. And that will cause the rapid expansion of the magma, a brutal explosion, and a really violent pyroclastic density current. So for a really simple classification, there are several, but I will just use a simple one here. We consider pyroclastic density current with a range of two different poles. One that is more dilute, which is called pyroclastic surge, and one which is dense and called pyroclastic flow. So here I present both in the same current, which happens in nature, but it's, of course, we can find, for example, the pyroclastic surge directly on the ground, but it doesn't interest me here. So in terms of transport, the pyroclastic surge are transported mostly by turbulence, okay, as here, and it's a dilute mixture. We consider generally inferior at 1% of particle, because if it gets denser, then turbulence is suppressed and we rather tend to generate a dense flow. On the other hand, the pyroclastic flow, it's much denser in particles. We consider a tenth of percent of particles, so the contacts between the particles are non-negligible anymore. And the transport can be dominated by friction and collision, which is called particle-particle interactions. This is a granular regime. But if the pressure of the fluid inside the pore here is strong, we can have also this particle-particle interaction replaced by fluid-particle interaction, and that's called the fluidized regime. And that's what interests me in this presentation. So why fluidization has been inferred for pyroclastic flows? Well, firstly, it comes from observation of deposits. So it has been observed that for some deposits, the extension of them was of several kilometers to tens of kilometers on very gentle slopes. That suppose that there were with very low friction, at least for part of their emplacement. Also, the upper surface of some deposits are rather flat and poorly inclined, that make think about a fluid that is stabilizing after being disturbed. Also, in some cases, we can see a really well density distribution inside the deposits with the dense particle that come mostly on the bottom of the deposits, like for example the lithics, with a normal granoclisement, so the size of the particle decrease with the height in the deposits, and on the other hand, the lighter particles like pumice are found in the top with the bigger particles reaching mostly the surface. Okay, so that is supposed to be called by a very strong segregation of density, and that is supposed to be possible only if there is low interparticle contact forces, at least for a well-defined density segregation as the one I show here. So there is some behavior that looks like the fluids, so that's why some flow are considered to propagate with the at least partially fluidized states. And by fluidized states, in my mind, it means high pore pressure. I will explain after what it is about. So what about the principle of fluidization? So really simply, fluidization is caused by a relative vertical motion between the fluid. So here I'm only interested in the gas. So between the gas that goes upward and the particle that goes downward. Okay, this gas will exert a drag force on the particle that will compensate the weight of the particle, and the pore pressure, so pressure inside the pores here, will increase. And as a result, the interparticle contact forces here will decrease or even disappear if there is a full fluidization. So in experimentation, we have two kind of setups here. So the first one is the most common because it's the easiest. It's just a bed of particles, a static bed of particles, at the bottom of which we inject gas, and the gas will come up and fluidize the bed. But also there can be a second setup, which is the release of particles inside an initially static gas. And that's the one that will interest me in the second part of my presentation. But here to explain more about fluidization, I will focus on this configuration here. So the pore pressure, as we see in this graph, the pore pressure is directly proportional to the gas velocity that we inject at the base of the particle bed. And it will reach one point, which is the lithostatic pressure. So at this point, the pressure does not increase anymore and it's more stable. And what I call lithostatic pressure here, it's basically the weight of the particles. This is the density of the particle bed times the gravitational acceleration times the height of the particle bed. Okay. And this maximum pressure is reached at a specific velocity that we call minimum fluidization velocity, or UMF. And this minimum fluidization velocity will depend on several parameters, but at the first order, it will depend on the particle size. So the bigger the particles, the stronger UMF will be. And so the most difficult it will be to fluidize the particle bed. And it has been experienced that for the matrix of pyroclastic flow, so the ash, the small particles of pyroclastic flow, this UMF can be as low as 1 millimeter per second. So suppose that some pyroclastic flows at least could be easily fluidized. So just to show you the effect of fluidization on the flow, I will just show two experiments. So one with a dry flow, meaning with no air flux at the base of the reservoir here, so in the granular regime. So what we can see is that the flow doesn't reach a really long run out, it's really short run out, and the upper surface here is rather steep, okay, which is normal for a granular bed, I would say. And if we fluidize, so in the second experiment, I will just inject air, so only in the reservoir here, not in the channel. And what we observe, so it's the same velocity, same configuration. Well, the flow is faster first and is reaching much longer distance. Here we are 3 times the distance, almost 3 times than the one of the dry flow with same configuration. And also the upper surface look more like a fluid, which it's more flat. It's a bit inclined because of course we don't fluidize in the channel, so there is defluidization. So now we'll talk about what we call defluidization. So we know that when the gas flux is stopped, the pressure does not vanish instantaneously, and it's more, it will decrease more exponentially and follow a diffusion law. That's why we call it pore pressure diffusion. Even in diffusion for pressure, it's a bit weird like that, but I will just call it pore pressure diffusion here. So what interests us is the duration of the diffusion, and this duration of diffusion is strongly affected by the bed thickness because it's the square of the bed thickness. So the thicker the flow, the longest it will take to diffuse. And it's also dependent on one coefficient that's called hydraulic diffusion coefficient that is proportional to permeability. And permeability is also controlled a lot by particle diameter. And it means here that the smaller the particles, the longest will be the duration, which is kind of logical here. But in terms of pyroclastic flows, if we take just the deposits and infer a thickness of the flow, well, this diffusion duration can last for some seconds in the case of really thin flow and coarse flow, so coarse particle flow, and it could theoretically last for several hours for very thick flow and fine grained. Okay. So that means that a fine-rich pyroclastic flow could potentially keep a partially fluidized state for a significant part of its emplacement, even if there is no more source of fluidization after the generation. So that's an important point. And there are several sources for fluidization that are supposed for pyroclastic flows. So the first one here I present, it's the gas released from the particles. That's the first one that has been described. Okay, the gas which is released by either diffusion, abrasion, or fragmentation. Also, it can be the air that is ingested at the front of the flow. When the flow advances, the air will pass below and be ingested. Also, when the flow propagates over water or over dense vegetation, because it's hot, it can vaporize it and create steam, and the steam, by going up, could potentially fluidize the flow. Sorry. And the last one I present here, it's if the flow falls from a cliff, for example, or a small obstacle, or when it compacts, well, there is a relative motion because the particle will go down and kind of squeeze out the gas, and this could create fluidization, and that's the thing that interests me also in the second part of the talk. Okay, so the general problematic of my PhD was to evidence some configuration that could favor the fluidization of the pyroclastic flow during their propagation, so that I call here autofluidization. And the first, first theory of experiment is the investigation on the influence of the rough substrate on the propagation of the flow. And thus this rough substrate has a big influence on the emplacement and also on the fluidization states of the flow. So for that I use this particular device, which consists of a reservoir where I put the particles before, so that's the same that I showed in the video previously. At the base there is a porous plate that allows the air to be injected. Okay. And this reservoir is linked to a channel that is 3 meters long, 10 centimeters wide. At the base of the channel, I glue different size of glass beads also to create the roughness. And to start the experiments, there is a sliding gate that is triggered by a weight. So I release the weight and the gates open kind of fast. So to film everything, I use a fast video camera, so to have because the experiments are rather fast, they last for 1 or 2 seconds, so I have to have more images to analyze. And I use pressure sensor here, which are fluid pressure sensors, so just to measure the pore pressure inside the flow. And that I put it in different locations to measure the fluidized state of the flow during this propagation. So for the flowing particles I used were mostly glass beads of 73 microns, so very fine glass beads. And they belong to what is called the group A of Gale-Dart classification. That just to say that they have the same fluidizing behavior as the ash in pyroclastic flow. So that has been experimented before. So that's why we use this particular kind of particles. I did the experiment in 2 regimes, so either fluidized or dry, meaning without the air flux at the base of the reservoir. And for the substrate roughness, so I glued beads on a plastic band here that I fixed at the base of the channel, and I use different configurations, so from a smooth substrate without any particles glued, to 6 mm rough substrate. Okay, so now I will present first the observation of the runout, the flow front kinematic, the morphology, to have an idea of what happens with a rough substrate, and then I will present the pore pressure measurements. So first, that is probably the most important result here. It's the two diagrams show the same thing, just the first one is the runout distance, the raw runout distance, so in centimeters, as a function of the substrate roughness, so the size of the glued beads at the base of the channel. And the second one is the same thing, that's the runout distance, normalized by the runout distance on a smooth substrate. So that's why we are at 1 here. Okay. So what we can observe here is the more you increase the substrate roughness, the longer the runout of the flow is, which is, for me, which was totally counterintuitive. Okay. It's the same for both dry or fluidized flows. So I try with bigger particles to see what happens, and with the 350 microns particles, we see that there is a different behavior because we have first a decrease of the runout and then no influence on the size of the particle on the runout of the flows. So we have something that only affects small particles here. Okay, so here is the flow front kinematics. So basically this is non-dimensionalized, so I can compare with other setup of experiments, but it's basically the distance in the channel as a function of the time, and for both fluidized and dry flow, but I will just show because it's more easier on just the fluidized flows, it's the same for the dry flows. Okay, so just the fluidized flow, we have 3 flowing phases. The first one, which is the acceleration, when we open the door, when the flow starts, it will accelerate until reaching a constant velocity, which will last kind of long, but then after this constant velocity, the flow will start to decelerate. And what we can see really clearly here is that the first 2 phases are not affected by the substrate roughness, and it's just the last phase where we can see that the rougher is the substrate, the slower is the deceleration. So we have something that kind of seems to reduce the friction inside the flow here. So now I will show morphology of the flow. So this is just the upper surface of the flow at a spatial time. Okay, just a cross-section of the flow. So we can see in the constant velocity phase that there is no much influence on the substrate roughness, but then when we reach the deceleration phase, we have kind of a separation of the flow with the body of the flow that stay basically the same, and the forward part of the flow that kind of separate from a sort of bulge that will just propagate longer and for a longer time in the channel, and that's why it will reach a much longer distance for the rougher substrate. So this part here, I will call it the flow head, okay? And just the flow head is affected by substrate roughness apparently. And the rougher the substrate, the bigger is this flow head. Okay, so just to show you, I will present other videos. So that's the same as the other one, a bit faster on the smooth substrate. And I will show you what happens with a rough substrate. Okay. So we can clearly see that this one is going at least twice longer than the one on the smooth substrate. That's the same configuration. Both flows are initially fluidized. And what we observe also is that this part here, the back part, is about the same for both flows, and it's just the front part that will propagate much longer in the flow, in the channel, sorry. So now I'm interested in looking at the pore pressure measurements, so with the pressure sensor that I showed you before. So I will present first in the most simple configuration for a smooth substrate. Okay, so what do we have generally? So that's the pressure as a function of time, okay, for initially fluidized flow and dry flow. And we can see that for initially fluidized flow, we have high pore pressure close to the reservoir, so at 10 centimeter. And this pressure decreases with time and decreases also with the distance. This is 50 centimeters, 90, and 150. Okay, The longer we go in the channel, the lower is the pore pressure. That is logical because there is a diffusion of pore pressure with time. Okay. There is also an under pressure, but that just happens when the flow front is reaching the pressure sensor, and I won't focus on it right now. So we just focus on the overpressure here. So for initially dry flow, what happened, and we have just the under pressure, but we don't see or we don't measure any significant overpressure, which is logical because we didn't fluidize the flow at first. So because this is just raw data, I will also normalize them by the lithostatic pressure, okay, so the pressure of the weight of the particle on top of the pressure sensors. And in that configuration, then when we have P over PL equals 1, we consider that we are fully fluidized, and when P over PL equals 0, we have no fluidization. So it's easier to work with and easier to compare with different flow configuration. So we have the same thing. We see that we have a decrease with time for the same location and a decrease with the distance in the channel, okay, and in the case of the smooth end of the initially dry flow, we have no difference. So now I will be interested in what happened when we put a rough substrate. So I compare with the smooth substrate here for initially dry flow because it's the most striking here. So we don't put any air at the base of the reservoir, but we still have high pore pressure measured at one part at least of the flow. We have high pressure peak, which suggests that just the forward part of the flow seems to be partially fluidized at least. Okay, so this, except at 10 centimeter, at 50 or 90 centimeters, so far from in the channel, we see that we are between 17.5 and 1. P over PL equals 75% or 100%. That means that this part is almost fully fluidized. Okay. Just to compare with initially fluidized flow, so we have the normal diffusion of the flow during its propagation. What happened with a rough substrate is that we see that the pore pressure remains very high, even very far in the channel, so even at 150 centimeters in the channel. So that suggests that there is a kind of renewing of pressure during its propagation, or preservation at least of high pore pressure during this propagation. So just to summarize what the principal result here, so we have an increase of the run-up distance with the substrate roughness only when the flow is composed of fine particles. Okay. The presence of the roughness causes the deceleration to be slower. That suggests that there is a reduction of friction, at least at one part of the flow. And with the morphology, we saw that only the head of the flow seems to be affected by the substrate roughness, and this flow head is characterized by high pore pressure, which means that somehow the presence of the rough substrate caused the autofluidization of the flow, or of part of the flow. So the hypothesis here is that, well, the flow propagates over the glass beads, and when the particles settle in the interstices, they kind of squeeze out the air that is forced to go upward, and by going upward, it will fluidize the flow. Okay, so that's just a video of the flow front of the flow head, which is taken at its slow like 125 times. Okay, so we see that it propagates over the beads, and that's the particle settles. Okay, so of course we are just against the glass wall here, so there are some differences that might happen in the center, but that's only how we can do it here. And just we estimated the velocity of the air flux, or at least the range of velocity, and we suppose it to be between 50 and 200 millimeters per second, which is still much higher than the minimum fluidization velocity of the fine particles, so the velocity at which it would be supposed to be fluidized. But with larger particles, so for example with the 350, this velocity is much higher, so that could explain why we don't see any influence of the substrate roughness. Okay, so of course, once all the interstices are filled by the particles, there is no more air source, so no more fluidization. That's why only the forward part of the flow would be fluidized. And the bigger the roughness, of course, the bigger are the interstices, and so the bigger the portion, the fluidized part of the flow will be. So that just, I did another set of experiments with trying to investigate on the influence of the slope angle, just the results for the pore pressure to show that even at 30 degrees, so very steep slope, we still have high pore pressure created for initially dry flow. So we have the same mechanism that is still effective at a steep slope angle. So now I will talk about the second kind of experiment that I did, which is the collapse of a bed of particles inside a static gas, so it's air here. So why did we do that? It was first to know if it's possible in this configuration to create high pore pressure and to preserve it in the bed, because that's not really, that was not really investigated. That is also to test the hypothesis of fluidization of the flow when this won't fall in over a cliff or over an obstacle, or when it compacts, for example. So this hypothesis here. And also to try, well, the previous fluidization hypothesis that I showed you in the first experiment, but at a larger scale, because here we have, we could consider that as interstice of several centimeters. So here it's 20 to 90 centimeters high. So this is the device for the second set of experiments. So this is just a 140 centimeters high column. So I put the particle in on top of the sliding gate, that's called here the reservoir, which is located either at 90 centimeters or at 20 centimeters, depending on the experiment I want to make. And to measure the pressure, I use pore pressure sensors at different heights, so from the base to 100 centimeters. And I investigate on several parameters that I won't develop all of them here at least, but just to show what we can do with this kind of experiment. So this is kind of a typical experiment. I took the same particle as the one from the flow of the previous experiments, and this is for a collapse height of 20 centimeters and bed thickness of 20 centimeters. And so what happens here is we release the gate here, and the particle will start to fall, but they don't fall all in one. At least at first they will fall very slowly with that remaining on the reservoir, and then there is a bubble that will kind of reach the upper surface of the reservoir and that will explode. Okay. So what kind of signal do we have for this type of experiment? So I just took two pressure sensors so we can see a bit more here what happens. So we have the sensor from the base here and the sensor in the reservoir, meaning 10 centimeters above the gates. So we can see there is, for the base sensor, there is three phases. First, an under pressure, okay, which happen only when the door starts to open, but as soon as particles start to fall, it will be replaced by overpressure, which I'll call here the first overpressure. Okay, and this first overpressure will kind of stop brutally when the bubble explodes and when all the particles are putting down into the deposits. And this first overpressure is followed by a second overpressure, which starts when the deposits start to form at the base, and which is the highest when all the particles are fall in the deposit. And then we can see that after the experiment there is a decrease of pressure with time. That makes think about diffusion of pressure. So if I just focus a little on the first overpressure and just tell the principal characteristics, where it starts when the particles start to fall from the reservoir. It decreases with the height in the reservoir. So here, the higher you're here, the lower will be the pressure. That's why we see here in the reservoir lower pressure than at the base. And for all sensors that are below the gate here, we have exactly the same signal. And to finish, it stops abruptly when all the particles here are out of the reservoir. So one hypothesis here was that we observed the same kind of phenomenon as the first set of experiments. So with the fact that the particle fall will evacuate, or at some point air will be forced to go upward and flow through the particle bed and fluidize it. Okay, that is kind of showed by the fact that we see this bubble of air, so that shows that there is air that is passing through the particle bed. But there can be also another explanation, at least for the first point of the overpressure. It could be also the fact that this bed is applying a force on the column of air here, because we see that it starts kind of it stays long in the reservoir before falling completely. But the fact that we have pressure in the reservoir make it kind of show that there is at least this process of fluidization happening, and that is kind of significant. So this first overpressure would be affected by different parameters. Here I investigated on the particle bed thickness. So you see that the more you increase the thickness of the particle bed at the beginning of the experiment, the stronger would be the pressure. But if we see, it seems that there is a trend, and if we look at what happened if we plot the P over PL, so lithostatic pressure here, equals 1, we see that it seems to follow this trend, even it's beginning to be a bit, well, lower than this trend, but in general it follows this trend, so we don't have a significant influence of the particle bed thickness on the fluidization state or on this first overpressure in this sense. Then I investigated on the particle size, the influence on the particle size, so that's the diagram that is directly normalized with the lithostatic pressure, and we see that even if there are slight difference, pore pressure is still high. That's the maximum pore pressure, of course. It's still high for all these kind of particles. But if we take really larger particles, here I took the 3 millimeters particles, we see that this first maximum pore pressure is lower, which is kind of logical if it's fluidization, because it would mean that, because in that case, the minimum fluidization velocity is very strong, so it's really difficult to reach just from the falling of the particles. So now I will focus on the second overpressure, so which starts only when the particle starts to form the deposit at the base. Okay, it's only measured by the pressure sensors that are below the deposit, which is really important here. And also it decreases, so except some points here, but that's just 1 or 2 points. But generally it's lower at when we go higher in the deposits. And last point, maybe most important point, there is a decrease of pressure with time after the experiment, so when there is no more particle motion, that looks like diffusion. So here the hypothesis is a bit more clearer than the first overpressure. It seems that during the formation of the deposit, the air is squeezed out, and so it goes up and fluidizes the forming deposits. Okay. So now we will just focus on this pore pressure decrease duration. So we have here the time of the decrease of the duration, sorry, of the decrease of pressure with bed thickness. So we see that the thicker the bed is, the longer it takes to decrease the pressure. And when we change the plot with putting instead of the bed thickness, the square bed thickness, we see that there is kind of a proportionality. And that is kind of coherent with the results of Iverson or on any pore pressure diffusion experiments that show that the diffusion duration is proportional to the square of the bed thickness. So here we suppose that we are in presence of a diffusion of pore pressure in the bed. So what happened with the size of particles? So that's the same size of particle I showed in the previous graph, so 73 microns. And now when we change the size of the particle, we see that for bigger particles, the diffusion duration is smaller, and it will increase. Duration will increase with decreasing size of the particles. And for particles that are here bigger than 160 microns, but just in this experiment, okay, when the particles start to be too big, the diffusion duration is almost negligible. So the pore pressure will diffuse almost instantaneously. So then I tried the same kind of experiments with ignimbrite, which is, well, natural pyroclastic flow deposits, so really fine grain here. The particle size is was sieved below 4 millimeters, and the median diameter was 63 microns. Okay. And what happens here is that we have the exact same pressure phases, okay, but what is striking is that the duration of diffusion here is much longer in the case of the ignimbrite, okay, and if we show, I will show the same diagram as before. So we have the ignimbrite, we see that the duration is much longer even for particles that are globally bigger than for the smallest glass beads I used. So somehow there is a lower permeability of the ignimbrite than the glass beads, at least for the same size. So that could be because of different parameters, but mostly probably because of the fact that the distribution of the particle is it's poorly sorted here. So there is a lot of very, very fine particles which will fill the holes between the bigger particles, so kind of lower the permeability. But there is also another factor here, which was observed during the experience, and maybe due also to the permeability. It's the fact that when the deposit starts to form, it is initially expanded. Okay, at first it is much expanded than the initial bed thickness, and it will compact with time. And by compacting, we think that the air will be squeezed out of the pores and kind of fluidized, renew the pore pressure of the deposit, even if mostly the pore pressure is diffusing. So that will explain why the diffusion is longer. There is a renewing of pore pressure, which is not the case on the glass beads, or at least of a lower extent. Sorry. So just to summarize here on this second study, we have a first overpressure that could be fluidization of the particles in the reservoir by the falling of the particle and the evacuation of the air that goes through the particle bed, as the first kind of experiment I did. Okay, but there is mostly the second overpressure. That's the most important result, I think, here, which show that they can be fluidization by just falling of particles inside a static bed, and the decrease of pressure is like the same from the other kind of with the other experimental configuration. We see that it follows a diffusion law that is proportional to the square of the bed thickness, and the diffusion duration increase with decreasing particle size, and is almost negligible for particles that are here in this configuration over 160 microns, but that can change when using different particles. And also an important result is that for real natural pyroclastic flow material, we see that we have the same pressure results, and that the diffusion is even longer for the ignimbrite. So it would be more efficient, fluidization would be more efficient in ignimbrite than in the glass beads that we used here. And so just to summarize the whole talk, so firstly, we could prove that there were fluidization during the propagation over a rough substrate, okay, which is caused by the upward flux of the air that is released from the substrate interstices. And this mechanism is potentially effective for all slope conditions, so between 0 and 30 degrees, at least experimentally. So that means that for all slope of volcanoes, we could have this mechanism. And in the second set of experiments, as I said, there could be fluidization during the collapse and the compaction of the particle bed, which is which could be kind of high and have a big impact on the flow fluidization. And it does not require a collapse from a high point, because here I show in the experiment I did collapse of 20 centimeters. So it means that really small break in slope or small obstacle could cause part of the flow to be potentially fluidized. And also during the compaction of the ignimbrite, as we saw, we have also potentially increase of the pore pressure, at least increase of the pore pressure of the duration of diffusion, So that would mean that there could be several episodes of fluidization during the propagation of one pyroclastic flow, because we suppose that there could be several obstacles during its pathway. So here it's like the final conclusion. There is a possible renewing of pore pressure during the propagation, so made by these two autofreezation sources. And that will, the impact on pyroclastic flow would be that there could be a conservation of a reduced friction for most part of their emplacement. Okay. Thank you for your attention.